What I learned when I studied design, and the first degree's in architecture, the second one's in design for film, I learned to tune into things. The first time I was invited to design something, it was at the edge of a garden. And I thought, well, we'll put a brick in, one brick, and then we'll put another brick in, like this. And then put another brick in. Oh, that's good, there's 3 bricks in a row. And once I'd studied for a while, it was more like, oh, how do I make it great? Okay, so it's gonna be this long, and it's gonna be, I want it to feel like this, and I want people to be able to stand up and look into it like that. And what I was using wasn't a process of thought, it was a process of intuition connected to some bodily impulses.
Have you ever heard of the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty? Merleau-Ponty?
No, I haven't. Tell me a bit.
He's a philosopher who, he's a phenomenologist, so that's the...
My favorite phenomenologist is Teilhard de Chardin.
Interesting.
Yeah, but carry on.
His phenomenology is very body-focused, so his posit is that consciousness is inseparable from embodiment, like physical existence in reality.
Bravo.
Basically, he just argues against the division of mind and body.
Huh.
And he instead says that it's reductive and wrong to conceive of a mind and a body, and instead we should be thinking of ourselves as beings that exist embodied. And the reason I bring that up is because I find that very striking, or similar perhaps to what you were saying.
Yeah, it sure is. We're right in tune. As soon as you started talking about this, I thought, yeah, okay, this is one of my most important deep wavelengths, is the false dichotomy of mind and body, consciousness and body, that they are one thing. Yeah. It's really become an important thing to me. And it's not what I went into, my intellectual or adult development believing. I would have sworn, as most of Western society does, that it's a distinct, there's the spirit and there's the body. Yeah. And those are very different things. I've become aware of many different systems that think differently about that, and started to tune into them and started to think, oh, okay. When I started studying architecture, it was a time when I was probably flirting a little bit around with evangelical Christianity, which has a very specific manifestation in this part of the world. I mean, there are lots of different ways that it characterizes itself. But I remember reading C.S. Lewis, and he was talking about, as sort of one of the vanguard theologians of the evangelical movement, and he was saying that, well, the Bible teaches us that only a person can have a spirit. A rock cannot have a spirit, because, talking about all the arguments why a rock wouldn't have a spirit. And when I was studying architecture, everybody that I loved most that was studying architecture, that was really into it, talked about the spiritual relationship that they felt they were developing between the physical manifestations that carved out space and the soul felt experience of people using it, and talking about the spirit of a space. If I got close enough to these people and we started talking about this, I would argue, oh, well, there can't be a spirit. It can't really be a spirit because of this way of thinking about things. There was a book that was present, Shock of the New or something like that, but it was essentially about how cathartic experiences that tend to deconstruct our mindsets led to a synthesis of new ways of thinking. And I guess I started to go through that because I recognized how closely I felt as a kind of soul connection with these fellow students who were so deeply into what they were doing. And I recognized that that's the way I felt too. But it was at odds with what I felt my belief system was shaping up to be. I came to take some time off from my studies. I took a theology course at a Catholic seminary, just in my spare time, out of interest. And there I encountered Teilhard de Chardin, because he's more of a theologian, I suppose, than a philosopher, because he's known as a phenomenological theologian as opposed to a phenomenological philosopher. And as a monk, and as someone who's from a very orthodox Catholic tradition, writing about how we live and breathe within the body of God. And noticing that that's what it says in Paul. God is the one in whom we live and breathe and have our being. And him inviting us to think of the entire universe as a manifestation of the divine within which we live. I guess it canonized the direction that I was going in, and I thought, oh, okay, well, I guess I can believe this. It's okay. It's okay. I'm way less dogmatic about anything to do with Christianity, although I hold it in high regard, and it's been an important source of community for me. But that idea that the divine is all around us and that it's present within us and that we are part of it has become a really important part of my life. And then there was clown school, which was 2 weeks solid with homework, finding personalities that lived in our bodies through yoga and meditation and sculpting things that we would eventually wear. And it's a tradition called the Pachinko clowning tradition, and it was developed in Eastern Canada based on European traditions of Commedia dell'arte, First Nations notions of spirit walking of some kind. And so you make these masks, and you put these masks on, and you become the character. It also tuned me to the relationship between my world and my character at a fairly deep level. My world both physically and emotionally.
Right.
And so it was great. I mean, we're having a pretty intellectual conversation. You know, if we were truly true to this whole notion of the body being so important, we'd be dancing this conversation, wouldn't we?
Merleau-Ponty is actually most popular in dance studies, more so than philosophy even.
He is, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. I can see why. And a lot of what I do now is in front of a computer in a fixed position, and everything is happening in that virtual reality.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't want to say that I live fully from my body and in my body. It's very much got to do with my eyes and my brain, and more my heart.
Right.
But also the physical feeling that I might feel as a result of what I'm designing. Those impulses are strong, but I don't move. I think it was, if it wasn't Teilhard de Chardin, it was somebody else who says, God's seat in the soul is the imagination.
Yeah.
And I just love that, and I really feel it. It can make me lazy sometimes, though. I'll sit back and think, okay, let me be inspired, and then I will do things.
I can say as a writer and someone who likes to do philosophy, I sometimes have the same problem.
Well, the first one was, there were three particular characters that I became. We all became that. That's the way we did it. And you mold this, I mean, you would spend first part of the workshop doing a lot of movement so that your body was stimulated by yoga activities and other forms of moving around and miming and a whole bunch of things like that. Then you would sculpt this face out of clay, focusing on something arbitrary. I mean, they gave us focus on the number 1, which is kind of great because meanwhile, your intellect is focusing on the number 1, but that allows your intuition to just do its thing. And you make this clay thing, make that into a mask, which you eventually put on. It's no longer clay, it's been molded with J-cloths and white glue, and you paint it all sorts of colors, and then you put it on. And by the time you put it on, I was just ready to move in a certain way. And it was still very true to me because one of the ways that I wanted to move, forget which eye it was, I think it was this one, was that I wanted to move around that eye. I wanted to rotate and spiral around my left eye, which is nice because that's the right side of the brain, which we associate with creativity. And even the mask kind of swirled around that one point. And so my movement was also swirling around that one point. The other experiences, that was the first one. They got more intense. And then by the end of it, you're investing all that kind of, but very inspecific focus of soul into a clown nose, which you then put on. And by then you've kind of hypnotized yourself that if you put that nose on, you can't help but go into a clown persona. So that's what it all leads to. You have to stay in touch with your own consciousness. We call that the editor. And we're talking about deep clowning. It's not learning how to wear big shoes and fright wigs. Those clowns are very extreme personalities, and you're really letting yourself go, and those clowns could be dangerous, they could be a danger to others, they could be a danger to themselves. They could do things that are inappropriate, so you stay sort of, you're riding along this clown self, and we call that the editor, and so you watch, and if the clown picks up a pair of scissors, you put it down, because that's an axiom. Nothing's more dangerous than a clown with scissors. So you're along for the ride, and it's glorious, but it's exhausting. It's not exhausting in the moment, but it's exhausting. It's emotionally exhausting when you're finished, because you're operating those two selves. But it's mainly because the clown is a pure energy, emotional, physical being, and you're fully inhabiting that. I took it because I was doing animation at the time. I was doing hand-drawn animation, and all of that unfolds at a drawing and then another drawing at when you're drawing a 24th of a second. It's so static that I took it because I wanted to experience character in at least real time. That's why I took the workshop. It would prevent me from being stuck in creative action as a series of static moments rather than a flow. So it gave me that flow, and I didn't really do it so that I could become a clown and do performances, although I was invited to do some, and they were pretty fun, but they were really tiring. But once I gave myself the liberty, and this happened before clown school, maintain all the requirements, because it's architecture that I first studied, and architecture has a huge number of requirements. There is budget, there's structural stability, there's the function of the things that has to happen. There are heating and lighting and air conditioning concerns. But the fire behind it for the person who's creating it is the way it all comes together into something wonderful that follows its own logic. So there's an awful lot of intellectual engagement. But it didn't really come alive for me until I started letting myself have kind of the same experience that I just described in clown school, riding on top of this person who was receiving sensuous cues from the way I arranged objects in space, or structure, or color, or light, or form. That intellectual side was really important to rein in that glorious horse of inspiration, to follow the orders that were necessary to meet those first few elements that I mentioned. And clown school allowed me to see that process for what it was. It starts by identifying the need. Why is this building needed? What does it need to do? What does it need to be? And that leads to the question of, what do the people occupying it need to do in the building, and how do they need to do that thing? That's the beginning. And out of that comes what's called, in the jargon of architecture, a program, that describes, the things that we already know about a kitchen. Well, what do you have to do in a kitchen? Well, we all know all the things. How much room does that probably take? What does it have to be close to? This is where it starts becoming an exercise in form. What does that kitchen need to be close to? What does it need to be far away from? What do you need to be able to see from the kitchen? What spaces need to be able to see into the kitchen? So it's easy for us to imagine that if we're designing a kitchen, but if an architect is designing a space for a facility that they don't know about, then it's very important to tease that information out of the client and the building users and find out what that purpose is. That will generate a diagram of, oh, there's this thing, and there's this thing, which begins to be an incarnate thing. It's just a diagram, but okay, well, this is here, and this is here, and this is here, and you start doing these diagrams, and that's the way it starts. That is much more the whole than the sum of its parts, than the parts, really. It starts, yes, it is kind of a gestalt thing, because you're just seeing these individual pieces, and then you start, one of the things you've asked about each space is about light and view, like outdoor light from the exterior world, sunlight. And all of those things start to give you an idea of where things should be, what should be open, where you should come into these spaces. Then you start thinking of these things in 3 dimensions. And then you start thinking about what has to be close to the outside. And all the time you're working with a site which has constraints of its own. And then the details follow from that. Well, I only went into architecture because I wanted to be a filmmaker.
Okay, so it was...
But in the neighborhood that I grew up in, if you were, everybody was a lawyer or an engineer or a doctor, and if you were cursed with creativity, then you had to be an architect. So I always knew that really what I wanted to do was film. But in those days, anything to do with film was a lot more complicated, way more complicated and expensive than it was now. And in my world, in Edmonton and Alberta, it just didn't seem like a feasible occupation at all. So I went into architecture. But those people that inspired me, that I spoke about at architecture, who really loved it from the soul, as I came to as well, as passionate as I was and still am about design and architecture, I'm more passionate about film. And I recognized that in one particular woman who was a girlfriend of mine. She felt about architecture the way I felt about film, and I thought, okay. So I got myself into the program at the American Film Institute in Los Angeles in design for film. And so I got a degree in what they call production design, which is the design of the visuals of film, the sets and all that kind of stuff. For a variety of reasons, I kept working in architecture though, and made my own little forays into film, which started out in animation and now are involving real live human people. And so I'm starting to do that more. On my clown teacher's website, she has a quote from me that said, "Clown school helped me solve problems at work." I forget what the exact wording was. I would have been described as a sensitive child. And working environments where there's a lot of money involved and things are high stakes, and these architectural environments can be that way, there can be some fairly intense personalities, and sometimes they can be quite critical, and sometimes you're dealing with someone who's just got a head of steam about something, and that can be pretty hard to interact with. I learned to flip into a version of a clown character to handle some of those people. That's a really good example of unexpected ways of solving problems. In any environment, there can be clashes of values. And I guess managing those have always been bigger struggles than, how do I make this building work in a nice way? Well, that's where Rumpelstiltskin comes in. Yeah. Was he able to spin straw into gold, or did you just say he could?
He could.
Yeah, he could do it. That's where Rumpelstiltskin becomes my inspiration, because he really could turn straw into gold. So the limited thinker in me, which is pretty well developed, do a certain amount of work and decide that this is wonderful work. And then a senior partner in an architecture firm might say, well, I think we should do this. And I'll go, and the client might say, oh, and I think we should do this. But Rumpelstiltskin would say, oh, or I might think to myself, oh, I've presented gold, and they've said, yeah, well, let's turn it into straw in this way and this way. And that's when I have to say, and be Rumpelstiltskin and say, okay, if it has to be limited in those ways, how can I do the very best version of that thing that I can be? Because I have to believe that well, no, I don't say I have to believe, but it's going to be more fun for me and more rewarding if I do believe that these things that are incontrovertible, I can't change these things, will lead to something that can be the best version of whatever it is. In addition to a Quonset community center in Calgary, it's a Quonset, as you may know, is shaped like this. The ground is here. It doesn't really have roofs. It doesn't really have walls. And it's just an extrusion of this shape. And it had a horrible addition which was falling apart and it had to be removed, and my job was to design an addition to it. Most things that are logical architecturally have walls and they have roofs, but it was attached to this thing that it's either all wall or all roofs, depending on how you think about it, and it has these curves. Just in about 20 minutes one afternoon, I said, well, there has to be roofs on these things, and actually this part has to be higher than that part, and the stairs are going up this way. That means the roof could start high and curve all the way down low where the stairs are, because the stairs are going this. And that would be very practical, because most buildings where there's a stair, they just have a great big empty space that you have to heat, and all the heat goes up there. So it's actually more cost effective to slope the roof around where the stairs are. But then there's this other part that still has to be high over here. Well, what if we slope the roof that way? And what if we curve both those roofs? What I generated was a shape that goes like this. So when you look at it from the end, you see these Quonsets, and then you see one roof going this way and one roof going that way, which I was really proud of. And also birds on the wing have a really special iconographic place in my. I love feathers, and I love the way they all the feathers change, just like seeing little frames in a film change. All the feathers are different, and they help the bird fly. So, yeah, I really liked that, and so did the community. Well, that's a pretty good question because I'm new to this city, being here off and on for the last 4 or 5 years from Calgary. And so I am making new communities here. My antennae are up for people who might be sensitive to the kinds of things that we're talking about. They're up for places where compassion and creativity come together. The people that I'm working in film are a source of community. I have my parents both grew up here, and so I have cousins and a sister and nephews and even a great nephew. So I have a ready-made community, a family, which I haven't had for years because I lived in Calgary for most of the last 30 years, and I don't have any family there. So there's family here and there's community in that. The church has been an important part of community building for me. I've managed to find churches where my thinking would be quite welcome, that aren't really dogmatic, and that's how I became trained as a grief recovery person. They needed a guy who would help because there were always women that wanted to get trained, and there were women who wanted to recover from their grief, but all these guys were suffering in silence. Rather than going broadly, when I went to Calgary, I thought, I need to meet a whole bunch of people and build my community. I find that I'm going deep. There are a couple of people that I have found a connection with, and I'm recognizing that there's great fruitfulness in that. So I'm recognizing that at this time, it's good for me to focus on the folks that I feel like I'm in tune with. Well, one of the things that primed me for the experience of the divine as an embodied reality that we all live in was when Alex Janvier, who is a First Nations painter, painted a frieze at the Mutt Art Conservatory in Edmonton. There are three or four great big glass pyramids, and they're around a central hub, and around that central hub there is a fascia that's up at about 10 feet, the 10-foot level. It goes all the way around. So it's circular, which already is getting us into First Nations iconography material. It's depictions of abstracted shapes, which are very much like animals, but they aren't exactly animals, but they look like animals and plants. And they're connected by these geometric lines, and everything is bright, different colors, many of the colors primary, and it wraps all the way around this white frieze. And somehow I learned that this, either I deduced or intuited, or probably more likely I heard a lecture of some kind, or that it was about how everything was connected and how everything was part of a whole. And I just thought, I remember that registering and me thinking, yeah. But that was long before architecture school, I think. It was before architecture school anyway. It helped me at a really subconscious level. It wasn't though I was thinking about the Alex Janvier thing, but whenever I would encounter it or whenever I would think about it, over the last couple of decades, I would think about how much that expresses my way of looking at the world. Not completely, because there are other metaphors that could be used. The metaphor of being in a swimming pool and being part of the swimming pool could be used. But that idea that everything is connected was a great catalyst for me. First Nations traditions have been a great influence for me. And as brief as they may have been, they have gone extremely deep. And what's great out here in BC is I think that reconciliation and concrete steps toward connecting the two societies, First Nations society and settler society, is something that I'm encountering as something that's much more well developed than it has been anywhere else that I've lived. And it's great to be able to talk about it, but I also recognize that I just don't want to appropriate it. I don't want to. I'm influenced by this, but my interactions, as fun and interesting as they have been, and as deep as they go, have been relatively superficial. And I recognize that there are opportunities for more, and I look forward to that. Well, Woody Allen once said, you're probably anticipating the quote. He said, they say people create art so they can achieve eternal life. But he said, I'd like to achieve eternal life by not dying. what's important about my legacy, despite all of the things we've talked about physical form, my legacy will be the way people I have loved love other people, and the way that chain carries down in the future. Not that I've necessarily been so good at it, but that's the part of my legacy that I want to go to when I think about what I might have provided for future generations. Honestly, I'm sure there's probably a part of me that just thinks, yeah, I've done this on this great building and people are going to wonder who did it, and it's going to be me. Yeah, that's probably there. Same with the movie part too. The generations, I don't know how old you are, but your generation, you're 22. Yes, well, your generation gives me hope. I see depth, I see compassion, I see broadness of thinking, I see creativity as a habit, thinking outside the box, not taking things for granted. I see compassion for traditions and compassion for elders as well. And I see more of all those things than I feel my generation had at that age. And so your generation gives me hope.